Bueno, buenas tardes para todos y para todas. Bienvenidos y bienvenidas al segundo ciclo de conferencias Autismo, clínica de investigación. Mi nombre es Sofía Márquez. Espero me estén escuchando todos y todas bien. Hoy vamos a tener la conferencia titulada Desorganización del movimiento en el autismo, su origen y evaluación digital, a cargo del doctor Jonathan Delafield-Butt de la Universidad de Strathclyde, Glasgow, de Escocia. A continuación, le voy a dar la palabra al doctor Daniel Camparo, que presentará el ciclo.
Bueno, bienvenidas a todos, bienvenidos todos. Un gusto enorme recibirlos a ustedes en nuestra casa de estudios virtual para una nueva edición de nuestro ciclo de conferencias. Estamos realmente animados con la visita que tenemos hoy de nuestro colega Jonathan y además de agradecerle a él también, yo quisiera agradecer a todos que han hecho esta iniciativa posible, desde la Universidad de la República, el sector de informática, el sector de medios, de comunicación institucional, las propias colegas que hoy nos acompañan, Sofía y Lucía también, que han hecho un excelente trabajo de organización, y también a la Comisión Sectorial de Investigación Científica, que ha proporcionado los medios económicos para realizar la actividad. Por último, decirles que la organización está a cargo también del Instituto de Psicología de la Salud y del Centro de Investigación Clínica en Psicología de nuestra facultad. Así que les deseo un excelente encuentro y un gusto enorme verlos a ustedes hoy.
Bueno, continuando, les contamos que vamos a tener una transmisión simultánea durante la conferencia. Valentina, quien está aquí presente, junto con Rosina, que se va a llegar en unos minutos, serán las intérpretes de hoy. Nos estarán ayudando a interpretar a Jonathan al español. Para ello, lo que tenemos que hacer es seleccionar en el botón de abajo que tienen un círculo que se llama interpretación, en el cual tienen que seleccionar el canal de audio español en el caso de que quieran escuchar en español o en inglés. Para ello, capaz que hacemos una prueba muy cortita, la cual les solicitamos que seleccionen el canal de español. Valentina va a hacer una prueba en la cual dirá unas palabras y así chequeamos que todos la escuchan bien. ¿Les parece? Valentina, ¿te animas a decirnos unas palabras para chequear que todos te escuchemos? Bárbaro, ahí ya están diciendo en el chat que te escuchan, así que perfecto. Bueno, continuando, comentarles que la conferencia va a durar 1 hora y luego tenemos un espacio de preguntas y respuestas de unos 30 minutos. Para ello tenemos también el botón debajo que dice preguntas y respuestas, en el cual solicitamos que escriban las preguntas ahí y luego van a ser contestadas. Como saben, en estas conferencias se entrega certificado. Estos certificados van a ser entregados con el nombre y apellido con el que se hayan inscrito y al mail que se hayan inscrito. Por lo tanto, les solicitamos que en caso de que se hayan inscrito con un nombre incorrecto o con un mail incorrecto, nos escriban al mail autismoclínicainvestigación@gmail.com para comentarnos cualquier inconveniente. Por otro lado, comentarles que podemos tener una demora de 1 semana, 10 días, dado que esto lo hacemos entre las compañeras y a veces lleva un poco más de tiempo de lo estimado, así que pedimos disculpas si hay ciertas demoras. Y bueno, siguiendo les voy a presentar a Jonathan. Jonathan Delafield-Butt es profesor de desarrollo infantil y director del Laboratorio Interdisciplinario de Innovación en Autismo en la Universidad de Strathclyde. Estudia los orígenes de la experiencia consciente y los fundamentos corporales y emocionales del desarrollo psicológico, prestando atención a la sutil pero significativa alteración motora que se evidencia en el trastorno del espectro autista. Realizó su doctorado en el desarrollo neurológico en la Facultad de Medicina de la Universidad de Edimburgo, extendiéndose luego a la psicología del desarrollo con la aplicación de la teoría de la intersubjetividad en su trabajo postdoctoral en las universidades de Edimburgo y Copenhague. Es miembro de la Asociación Mundial para la Salud Mental Infantil, la Sociedad Internacional de Investigación en Autismo y en el Centro de Neuropsiquiatría Gilbert de la Universidad de Gotemburgo. A continuación, y sin más, damos comienzo a esta conferencia. Espero que todos la disfruten. Agradecemos nuevamente a Jonathan por la participación de hoy, a Valentina y a Rosina por la interpretación, y bueno, los dejo.
Great. Yeah, thank you very much, Sophia, and also for that warm introduction. And also thank you, Valentina, for translating this, and Lucia, if you're translating later, thank you. And Daniel, thank you very much for this invitation. It's an honor to present at the University of the Republic in Uruguay, and I'm delighted to do so. I wish I could be with you in person, but of course we have some logistical issues. A pandemic is in the way, so I'm presenting to you from my house because my university is still closed because of the lockdown and the issues with the virus. So, but the world moves on. So I want to talk to you today about my work and about what we do in my laboratory, because we do some unique things and we combine unique perspectives, I think, in a novel way with technology. So as Sophia said, my background is from medicine, or medical science, I should say. But really, I'm a biologist, and I look at people and the natural world from the view of a biologist. But that includes mind. So mind is included in nature. It is a part of life. It is a part of living organisms. And so it's also the job of biology to study it. And this becomes important for medicine because obviously pathology requires treatment and care, but it's also important for education because we care for the minds, the growing minds of our young children. And it's important for related disciplines such as social work and care work more generally, early years work. So we try to bring this all together in the lab, and I will just put my slides up so you can see those as we progress. Just excuse me there for a second. Okay, can you see that okay? Is that clear?
Yeah.
So.
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, so the title of my talk is Disruption to Movement in Autism, and it's Smart Device Digital Assessment. So what we've come to know is that autism, although it's a social and emotional condition, it has underpinnings that are becoming more clear in the motor system, or I should say in the sensory motor system, the way that we move with purpose in the world. It's understanding that purposeful movement, its psychobiology and its neurology is the purpose of our work, and adding to that digital devices with the new technologies that have become available to be able to detect motor patterns and therefore to be able to identify autism early is one of the key drivers of our work. So our lab, if I can read the translation, it's quite surprising to see my slides in Spanish. But the purpose of our lab is to bring together these multiple disciplines, and that includes engineering and a large degree of engineering help, because the new technologies introduce data science, machine learning, algorithms, artificial intelligence, means of data analytics, and also the hardware engineering, the sensor engineering that goes alongside it. So Strathclyde is a very strong engineering university, and we borrow on their skills in order to be able to develop new devices for the early detection of autism. My lab was opened by Professor Sir Jim MacDonald, the Vice Chancellor and Principal of my university, and it's supported quite strongly by him and colleagues both in education, engineering, and psychology. So autism is a developmental disorder. It starts very early in life, possibly in utero, although that still requires investigation. It's a lifelong condition, typically, so it has a lasting effect from the very beginning of life. Its support and care costs the UK economy about £32 billion in the UK alone. So that's a significant health economic so-called burden Early identification can help relieve that burden because we now know from recent studies that early identification can lead to early care and assistance with the family and with the children who are developing with autism for the best outcomes possible. And that can alleviate that health economic burden and make the country, therefore, a stronger and healthier place as a whole. Its prevalence is up to 1 in 58 children. This is recent data from the United States, but it doesn't seem that there are biological differences in areas of geography, more to do with environmental ones. So that prevalence may be a global prevalence, but that picture is not quite clear. It could be more like 1 in 100 is perhaps the figure that people would go for. It ought to be detectable from birth, but currently it's not. And this is the holy grail, one of the holy grails, I should say, of autism research, is the early detection of autism, so that we can give that early intervention as quickly as possible. So by bringing together engineering, psychology, psychiatry, education, we aim to be disruptive and challenging to the status quo. We don't want to do the same things that have been done before, because we've known about autism for decades, but the care and support for children for autism, although it has improved, our scientific understanding needs a step change. It needs to improve faster, and we need better knowledge to be able to understand autism from multiple disciplines and multiple perspectives. So we want to challenge the status quo to catalyze that change and to catalyze that knowledge and to advance the scientific logic and use technology to do so. So in this stepwise process, we want to move in that way from basic knowledge, so theory and basic science, to engineering, or I should say through engineering, so that we can make useful tools to assess and identify autism and also to study it, to clinical studies, so that we can understand how this looks in terms of possible clinical tools that could be used in the clinic, or indeed could be then translated for use in education context or nurseries. And then, of course, the policy and the practice element of it, because this needs to be supported by governmental support in terms of funding, but also in terms of social organization and goodwill or wish to make this happen. So we work with a number of institutions around the world for these aims, from theory, through the engineering, through the clinical science, and into policy and improved practice, both in education and in clinical practice within medicine and the allied health services as well. These colleagues of ours, we all share a common perspective, which is wanting to understand autism from a motor perspective and developing new technologies in order to facilitate that. So it's innovation in autism, theory, technology, and practice all together as one. And we're motivated by Roger Sperry. So Roger Sperry was the Nobel Prize laureate in physiology or medicine in the 1980s. And he studied split brains quite famously. And his PhD student became my mentor, Colwyn Trevarthen, which is where a lot of this kind of knowledge or spirit of discovery has come from. And he made a quote, or he said something which I quote quite often, because it sums up why movement is so important. He said, motor coordination is the sole product of brain function. Everything we do is orchestrated and shared with others and through the organization of body movement. The movement of my voice for speaking is a delicate and very precisely timed articulation of a whole orchestra of musculatures to produce these articulated sounds which represent words or concepts, which are put into phrases to make meaning, and those phrases into arrangements of ideas which can be communicated and shared with others. That's motor action. That's motor movement. It's neuromotor control. If I'm angry, I might squash my face or pound on the table. That's action conveying emotion, conveying feeling. It's the product of the brain. There's nothing the brain does that is not outputted in motor control. All our thoughts, if we close our eyes and stay still, if we want to share those thoughts or put them into action, it's through motor control. So, where does that begin, that motor control that allows us to express our thoughts, our feelings, our desires, and our intentions? It begins very early in life, and this is the backstory to understanding autism. It's understanding the development of emotion, which motivates action, motivates motion, and how this development of emotion and movement arise very early in life, because of course autism is a disorder of emotion and social engagement, at least in the clinical definition, and underpinning that we now recognize is motor control or movement. So, two fundamental psychological principles. Principle number one is, I like to move it. Principle number two is, I like to move it with you. There's a certain satisfaction in moving. As human beings, we are compelled to move. And as human beings, we are also compelled to move with each other. We are obligatorily gregarious, as Heidegger has taught us. In other words, we require social engagement. We need it. It gives meaning to our personal lives, and it gives meaning and structures our social lives, so that we can have understanding in intersubjective communication. The word intersubjective simply means subjectivity coming from two sides, from two people, the intersubjectivity. The mind of one person, the feelings and thoughts become shared with and in the mind of the other person, and vice versa. That's intersubjectivity. If you think about the compulsion to share ourselves with others, Sean Gallagher, a philosopher from the University of Florida in the United States, I think he's in Kentucky now, or Tennessee. Sean Gallagher made the point that one of the hardest and harshest punishments that a country or a judicial system can give is solitary confinement. In other words, one of the hardest punishments, most painful punishments, is to be alone, not social, but alone. That speaks to how social we are as a species. Another way of looking at these principles, more technically now, thinking more in terms of neuromotor control and psychological principles, is that movements are self-generated, affect-driven, prospective, intentional acts, right? This will become clear as we move through the talk. Principle two is that movements are made in concert with social others sharing intentions. We share those intentions, and that's how movements become coordinated. This gives meaning making and social interaction and intersubjective engagement. So these more technical terms will become clear. This is a quote from Franz Brentano. He is a philosopher who reinvigorated the notion of intentionality, or the intentional. And he says, every mental phenomena is characterized by what the scholastics of the Middle Ages called the intentional or mental inexistence of an object, and what we might call reference to a content, direction toward an object, or immanent objectivity. Now, what Franz Brentano is saying is that if we reduce mind to its core parts, we are left with something called the intentional or object directedness. So you can strip away most cognitive skills, abstraction, planning, strip away the content of memories. You can strip away most of experience, the sensory differences of sensory modality, but at its core, what is mind is something intentional or object directed. It's that intentionality. So I did some work with some philosophers, which I found very productive, to look at this logic about the intentional structure of mind. And we try to understand that with respect to movement. Because we know from movement science, from Bernstein and Klaus von Hofsten at Uppsala, that biomechanics of movement, because movement is a physical thing, the biomechanics of movement require prospective control. So prospective control is control with knowledge of the future, control with a view to the future. Actions are expensive evolutionarily and energetically. So the organism has to make these actions useful and economic. And it does that by understanding the forces and the consequences of a movement before the movement arises. Now, the before the movement arises is very important because it knows ahead of time what the movement outcome ought to be. So that is an intentionality, an object directedness, a prospective view, a knowledge of the future that is coming. So we reasoned that this matches what Brentano was saying, as every mental phenomena includes something as object within itself. It's a core object directedness that's physically and fundamentally necessary for the organism. This something as object must be born out of this prospective control. Every action we now know anticipates a goal because of the work of Bernstein and Klaus von Hofstede, Colwyn Trevarthen and others. So an object is its consequence. So every action presumes a sensory motor contingency. So we reasoned and tried to define that this is what we can identify as intentionality, or a sensory motor intentionality, just to clarify the terminology. Let's have a little look at what that might look like.
That's okay.
Yeah, you're good. You're really good. So this is a newborn baby, 1.5 days old, lying on a table with a blanket in the hospital, and we're filming the baby and recording the movements of his arms with these little reflective markers and motion capture equipment. So we wanted to ask the question, do those movements, are they organized with intent in the sense that they are sensory motor, that they have sensory motor intentionality, or are they disorganized and chaotic reflex reactions with no mental quality at all? They're coherent, organized, and if we look at the mathematics of those movements, according to this theory of prospective organization, general Tau theory, the movements of the infant's arms match the theoretical prediction to a significant and high degree, which suggests that those movements are prospectively organized. And if they're prospectively organized, then we can say that they are intentional of this basic kind in ontogenesis, of an early kind of intentionality, an object directedness. What this tells us is that they are experienced. There's a psychology behind those movements. They're not just simply mindless reflexes, and the feelings and intentions of the baby are therefore irrelevant to them, but rather they constitute and are constituted by those particular movements. If we look at the mathematics, we can also we can also use these data to differentiate prematurely born infants who are at risk for neurodevelopmental disorder and neonatal infants born at term and healthy. There's a small but significant, statistically significant difference in the degree of the tightness of that coupling, or of that prospective control. So this teaches us that not only that these are mindful movements, but also that we can potentially use them as an early assessment indicator of neurodevelopmental distress. And much more work needs to go in to do that. And that's one of the kind of long-term aims of my lab. So this primary sensory motor intentionality is pre-reflective, it's pre-conceptual, because it arises in development before abstraction, concepts, language, of course. It's future-oriented and it's simple, and those words are quite precise, so they're quite good definitions. The next question is, well, when does this arise? Because of course, in development, a baby isn't simply born out of thin air. It develops in utero over a period usually of 9 months. So the baby is moving, interestingly, from 7 weeks gestational age. By 12 or 14 weeks gestational age, the full body has already formed by 8 weeks, and it's starting to move its particular limbs independently of the other limbs, and guiding those limbs to touch things like the placental lining or the umbilical cord or the uterine wall or his or her own face. And in the case of twin pregnancies, a twin will move to touch the other twin with a different action pattern than it moves to touch itself. Then it moves to touch the uterine wall, but the same action pattern that it uses to touch itself. And what we know from that now is that the infant, in the case of twin pregnancies, anticipates or knows ahead of time what it's going to touch. So it has this prospective knowledge, and it shows signs of this basic kind of intentionality. So the infant is minded, apparently, from a very young age, certainly by 18 to 22 weeks, but probably as early as 14 weeks, according to, for example, the data from Castiello et al. In 2010. There's a number of other extremely important researchers, Alessandro Piontelli, who has studied very detailed ultrasonography to understand the complex behaviors of these infants, Miyowa Yamakoshi and Takashita in Japan, who have similarly studied the way that the infants bring their hands to the mouth and anticipating the hand touching the mouth. And Nadia Reisland at the University of Durham has done comparable work showing similar anticipatory awareness at a very young age. So what this means is that experience, psychological experience, consciousness, as it were, in a basic or primary sense, arises very early in development. And we now recognize this as so-called primary consciousness, following Jaak Panksepp, the comparative neurophysiologist from Washington State in the United States, and his colleagues. So they call this the integrative seat, the integrative core function of consciousness is this primary consciousness, which is able to map and organize intention actions. Now, all of this is happening before the cerebral cortex has developed. So at 14 weeks gestational age, the cerebral cortex is immature. It's effectively offline. The thalamocortical projections have not completed, and vice versa. So all of that activity that you saw in the fetus, and then subsequently patterning also the more complex activity of the neonate, it's predominantly subcortically organized. So Penfield and Jasper, who were neurologists from the 1950s, they made the point that actually the cortex is not necessary for conscious activity, but the brainstem and midbrain regions are. So the brainstem, although it is anatomically subcortical, it appears to be functionally supracortical, so organizing the activities of the cortex. And it's the necessary part for conscious experience. Not vice versa, as some would argue. This is also evidenced in anencephalic children born without cerebral cortices. And you can, well, here's the brainstem. You can see very clearly this is the brainstem and midbrain complex at the center of the encephalon, so at the center of the head. This is why the early neurologists called it the centrencephalic theory of consciousness. But children can be born from time to time without a cerebral cortex, but these children can live relatively successful lives for a matter of years until development proceeds and the cortex begins to take over autonomic function, and then these children's lives are shortened, sadly. But while they are alive and well, they can engage with others, they can share emotions and experiences, they can perform tasks themselves, intentional motor tasks. This is the point that Bjorn Merker, the neurologist from Sweden, has made very strongly in his paper called Consciousness Without a Cerebral Cortex, a challenge for neuroscience and medicine, because it challenges and upsets the thought that actually the cerebral cortex is responsible for consciousness. So it's a very important point about how our subjectivity is organized in terms of its composition. So we now understand that the cortex, although neuroscience focuses very heavily on it, it's not necessary to be conscious, to have feelings, to act with intentions, to perceive and appraise the environment, and to engage socially and purposefully with others, or to even to learn. And this idea is corroborated by experiments in cats and rats, where they are surgically decerebrated. So adult cats and rats have their cortex removed, but their brainstems left intact. And these cats and rats can navigate over tricky terrain, copulate and wean litters, all without a cerebral cortex. So the cortex, in many respects, can be a distraction from something that's more fundamentally true. And this is what we're driving at in terms of also trying to understand autism. So we now understand consciousness, our subjective experience is being organized along three levels, the so-called triune brain of MacLean, but now we understand it from Jaak Panksepp's work in much greater detail. There's an early ontogenetically primary preconceptual conscious experience, which is mediated by the brainstem, right? It's affective, it's evaluative, it's phenomenal consciousness, it's experience of the here and now, but it has access to the distance receptors, the eyes, the ears, also the tactile receptors, taste and the haptics. It has senses of the muscles of body action, and it also has access to interoception, so the internal organs of the body, their functioning and needs. And we now are coming to understand, and we're developing this understanding, that autism may be, and this is our hypothesis, a disturbance to primary conscious experience, and the way that that primary conscious experience communicates with the upper levels. So this is a working hypothesis that's, I think, very exciting at the moment. So that primary consciousness communicates with a secondary consciousness, which is a secondary level, which is responsible for operant conditioning, for learning, for processing emotions and affects or feelings in a more refined and precise manner. And it's responsible for perceptual awareness. Primary consciousness informs and structures that secondary, and that secondary informs and structures the primary, so they communicate. And again, it seems that in autism, there's a disturbance between these levels of communication, between these levels and in the way that they communicate. And finally, what we typically think of in psychology is what we now understand as tertiary consciousness or tertiary subjectivity. These are tertiary affects and neocortical awareness of functions. That's the reflective self that's able to close your eyes and think about things, plan, produce schemes, and produce imagination, to develop the sophisticated control required of language and things like this. It's the place of what people typically think of as free will, right? Or intentions in the old and the common way of thinking about intentions. But Searle qualifies this as not intentions simply, but intentions to act. So we have the ability to think about an intention or think about an act and then do it, right? It's not in the immediate moment, it's abstract and disembodied. This is what we now understand in terms of the nesting of these different layers of processes, that all together in neurotypical individuals produces a coherent, integrated conscious experience. But in autism, we think that the primary level is disturbed and the communication between levels is disturbed. So this is Jaak Panksepp's diagram to explain that nesting, where we move from primary process emotions, deep affects that are subcortical, brainstem mediated, with their intentions actions or intentions in action, moving through the secondary process of upper limbic learning, into this tertiary process, which is largely neocortical of abstract reflection and plans, conceptual development, and so on, all of the cognitive tools that give us our unique our human uniqueness. And these are nested one within the other and must communicate efficiently, one within the other. But that efficient communication is likely to be disturbed in ASD. This is what we're driving at. This is related to Freud's id and ego and so-called superego, but this primary process is more closely related to what he would call the id. And of course, in the present moment, in our present moment of experience, it cuts across all of those levels to give one particular coherence. Okay, I'm going to try to speed along and jump through some of these ideas. The point here is that our actions are always organized in a serial way, right? So when we act, we reach to grab a cup, for example, we bring that cup up to the mouth, we tip the cup, and then we drink, right? So that's a classic example of a sequence of actions. Each of those actions has to be coordinated in time with each other, and that requires future thought or future organization or a future vision, right? But they're all contingent on efficient action in that single space, right? That single move from where I am in one position to the goal of that position, the cup in this case, right? I've got a cup here. So as the future grows, so our understanding about action contingency grows. And you could say our intelligence grows because we can see how things may unfold in the future from the present moment in time. And there's a temporal organization to this, of course, because each action takes about 200 to 1,200 milliseconds, or about a second. And when you do a project of actions like drinking coffee, for example, it takes 1 to 2 seconds or 1 to 3 seconds. But then if we have more complex actions like drink coffee while you're talking to your friend and making dinner, then that project may take 20 minutes or 2 hours, right? And we have to plan these actions or have some sense of knowledge ahead of time about how they're going to unfold. So this primary level we see is operative in the neonate. This is a newborn baby reaching to latch onto the breast for feeding straight after birth. It requires action, primary action on the level of the baby, with the more sophisticated or tertiary understanding from the mother and sometimes the grandmother or the nurse. They need to coordinate their intentions. So this is the eye gaze, mutual eye gaze meeting now in order to join and engage in the common project with a shared goal. And they reach that goal through that coordination of intentions and coordination of motor actions, the two being at this point in development the same thing for that infant. And the result of that is satisfaction. When that project is achieved, satisfaction ensues on both sides. The mother is satisfied in this case, the baby is satisfied in this case. That's a feeling, it's an affective sense of accomplishment. We see this also, the serial organization of simple actions in developing in complexity and capability in child development. Here is a toddler.
Yay, bravo, Juliet, bravo.
So this toddler steps 1 foot in front of the other, a simple action, 1 foot, 1 foot, 1 foot, 1 foot. But then the project is completed. She's done what she intended to do, to move and walk with the truck. And now she wants to share that socially with her father. And she does, and joy ensues. So satisfaction now enhanced and elaborated becomes joyful. So we understand these experiences, this conscious organization moving from primary through to secondary in late infancy and through to tertiary in early childhood. It's a growth of the body. It's a growth of the body, but also a growth of purposes of action and feelings of competence and also knowledge. And it's a growth of the experience of life in the world and engaging with the world and later in society. So this is the principle number one that I mentioned at the beginning. This is, I like to move it. We're inherently driven to move, and we find satisfaction, which can be enhanced and elaborated as joy and elation and fun with just in the simple intrinsic joy of making the movement. And we see this in all kinds of human activity. It could be skiing, it could be climbing, it could be tightrope walking. In young children, of course, they challenge themselves with movements, with new movements, because they find joy in the accomplishment of the act. Principle 2 is I like to move it with you, or the fact that we're socially gregarious. We like to move with each other. So now these movements have to be coordinated in time with each other to do something like a complex dance. This is from Daniel's D-Psych thesis, his doctorate. Wonderful images of children and adults working with each other, moving in time, in concert with each other, sharing the rhythm, sharing the feeling, and sharing the intentions of the movement, and sharing the affect, the joy in moving with each other and moving successfully in oneself with other people. So this is fundamentally important for learning. It's fundamentally important for development. This cooperative cycle of reciprocity, of intentions, of feelings and actions is not just psychological, but it's biological. It forms the foundations of how we build our brains and bodies. We also see that cycle of reciprocity acting within physiological systems, both intrapersonally within oneself, but also interpersonally between individuals. And as conscious professionals, we also have sympathy and understanding, or also as caring adults. So we can adjust the way that we move with each other in terms of offering the best care and support possible, which is what mothers do naturally, and what we can learn to do professionally, and we can learn professionally to do it even better than what we would be innately driven to do, right? These events are made in cycles, and when those cycles are complete, joy ensues. It's a joyful accomplishment. We see these patterns also in very, very young babies. This is a prematurely born baby in the hospital now with a similar camera system that we saw before. And the mother is telling a story as she's interacting with her baby, and her baby is contributing to that story and helping to shape it. So learning the patterns of his particular culture as he's engaging in them. Let's have a look at that.
There you go. Yeah, look at you moving around. Aha. You woken up? You woken up, mister? Say good afternoon. Good afternoon, wee Ben. How you doing? Oh, look at that big smile. Oh, that's probably... Look at that big smile. Hiya. Hello there. Whee! Oh, you kicking your mum? Are you kicking me? Have a big wriggle then. Go on, have a big wriggle. Oh dear. Oh dear. You having a big wriggle?
So the mother and the baby are sharing in the sequences of actions and the feelings in each of those actions. And careful analysis reveals that interaction follows a narrative cycle or a narrative sequence. There's an introduction as the mother begins talking to her baby and the baby begins to respond. There's a cycle of action and reciprocal action. Then it develops over cycles of action and on both sides, and increases in energy or intensity before it comes to a peak moment of excitation or climax, where the baby is giving facial expressions, moving his whole body. The mother's voice is very high at the octave above middle C, before the whole thing is brought to resolution again and a quiet place. And then there's a coda, which is the ones here, or a small repetition of the motif. So we've identified this as narrative, or as the narrative pattern. It follows the same narrative pattern that's found in all the time-based arts of drama and music and poetry and so on. All the time-based arts follow this narrative pattern, and you don't necessarily need words to create narrative or to create meaning with another person. It can be pre-linguistic, as it is here. although the mother's words are used to structure it, because that's how she has learned to express herself. The baby expresses himself in a different way. So this is an analysis of that particular pattern. The asterisks are where the baby is smiling, or little mouth smiles, and these plots here show the movements of the left and the right arm, and you can see at the moment of climax the baby is moving a lot. And you can also see here, this is the pitch glide of the mother's voice. So this is the pitch of each of the mother's expressions. They're both rhythmic in terms of setting a tempo for the interaction. And they also have these pitch glides which are ascending from middle C to the octave above middle C, C5. And this is the area of positive regard. It's where humans communicate positive affective feelings, where we communicate positive feelings. And it also raises the energy, and which is what it's done here in the climax. But then she brings the whole thing down again in this descending pitch glide from the top of middle C right down to middle C, and then into this lower pitch and more depressive area to bring the energy back down and to create, therefore, a narrative pattern or a narrative sequence across the whole thing. Which looks a bit like this: an introduction, a development, a climax of peak excitation and energy, and then a resolution again. And this is typically in an orchestra, for example, the individual instruments would be introduced in isolation, then they would come together rhythmically in the development of the orchestral piece. The thing might crescendo with all of the instruments coming together at one moment for the climax. And physically, that is the most energy, because that is the most movement that's happening at that particular time, and the most psychological or affective intensity as well, before the whole thing concludes or resolves. So interestingly, that narrative sequence, which structures our human understanding and the way that we share things with each other, is predicated on timing of movement and sharing intentions in the timing of the movement. And I'm telling you all of this because we're going to come to understand why autism might be a disruption to that very feature. I'll give you one more example. This is a child walking down the stairs now who is 5 years old. He's in a special school, a special class, because he's disruptive, and he needs more care and support in order to learn the culture of the school, to learn to regulate his emotions and his energy, and to engage in the learning. This is Scottish, by the way, so this is some Scottish accent. So I don't know if you caught it at the end, but at the end he says, woohoo! And again, it's this joy or elation, satisfaction in the accomplishment of a task. The task was rhythmic, it was shared, they shared the timing. Now the teacher did that very purposefully by holding the child's hand, excuse me, and walking down the stairs. So that structures their interaction and makes it a little bit easier for that child to engage in that structured timing and shared action. And it has parts to it, because they walked along the corridor, down one flight of stairs, down another, and down another. And each part made a little narrative project in its own, and all together, the whole project of walking down the stairs created a shared narrative experience of that teacher with the child. And now when that child walks down those stairs, he will have that experience and he will remember the counting. And so he's learning as well numeracy and other skills at the same time. This is basic nonverbal or pre-verbal narrative now becoming imbued or elaborated with words. Okay, so if you remember, motor coordination is the sole product of brain function, just going back to our mentor or inspiration through Roger Sperry. There's strong evidence now that's showing the brainstem to be disorganized in children and individuals with autism, a subtle but potentially significant disruption to the neuroanatomy and neurophysiology of the brainstem. And this is becoming more clear as the years go by and we have more research on the particular topic. Now, if you remember, the brainstem is responsible for this primary sensory motor experience, intention actions, the immediate moment of intending in action. We know that the timing of motor actions in children with autism is also disrupted. So the way that children move their hands to grab a cup, for example, or reach to grab a pencil, or reach to touch another person is subtly different in autism than it is in neurotypical children. We also know the brainstem is involved through studies that show hyper and hyposensitivities. Arousal is often dysregulated in autism, and arousal, obviously, it's the job of the brainstem to regulate. The neurophysiological autonomic regulations are dysregulated, not only in movement, but also eye gaze, which is again regulated through the brainstem. And things like the prosody in speech, the prosody which conveys affect and feel in speech, is also regulated from brainstem nuclei. So it's actually responsible for a lot of things that we typically attribute to the cortex, and that we know are disrupted in autism. So this is a key area of interest for my group and for my collaborators. We did one study with Filippo Muratori, who I think has come to this particular lecture series in a previous year. And Filippo has done extremely good work on understanding the early developmental differences in autistic children's movements. And now we're using that interest to look at the brainstem as the coordinator, the neurological underpinning of those movement differences. This is a study from 76 preschool children, typically developing, healthy and typical, and 76 preschoolers who are developing with autism. And what we found was that the brainstem's volume, so their size, was greater in those children with autism than in the typically developing children. And they had a different shape. Their shape was different. And we've got a new study ongoing to understand those shape differences better, and therefore to be able to understand with greater precision what's causing those shape differences. They also found that the IQ was also strongly related to the size and shape differences in the and could account for a degree of the shape differences in the autism group. So there's something that's related to intelligence as well in terms of autism brains, in terms of brainstem shape and volume. Okay, so the brains appear to be implicated, but we need to understand, the brainstem appears to be implicated, but we need to understand better what is driving that volume difference and those functional differences. One area that's of particular interest to me is the so-called inferior olive. It's a sensory motor timing nuclei. It's responsible for skilled movements like reaching to grab a cup. And we know that it's disrupted in what seems to be a majority of individuals with autism. So this is a healthy control on the left-hand side. This is a sample from post-mortem histology of an adult with autism on the right-hand side. And you can see it's dysplastic and broken, which means its function will be incoherent or less well organized. And that particular nuclei is responsible for this very subtle but important control of timing of movement. So this is a very interesting nuclei that we're looking at. It's not the only thing that's probably going on in the brainstem, but it's one important aspect of it. The inferior olive creates an isomorphic electric field of about 5 to 13 hertz. This is just getting technical about why it's creating that motor disturbance, because that 5 to 13 hertz electric oscillation is needed for that fine coordination of sensory and motor information. So we're now beginning to understand autism a little bit like this, that there's a disruption to motor timing, then that leads to a disruption to expressive intention, and that can lead to a disruption in social and affective engagement, because it requires coordination of timing and intentions expressed through motor timing to get coherent and efficient social communication, social and affective communication early in life, that intersubjective engagement. There's other things going on, but this is the motor perspective. It's gaining ground, is becoming very popular in the literature, which we're very happy about. This is Liz Torres's article, or her special issue. I think the views are now more close to 1 million. So people are becoming much more interested in this as the knowledge is developing and growing. This is a study we did some years ago now, using an iPad tablet to be able to diagnose autism. And the media reports were very positive around that. The first paper is now very highly cited and has led us to develop a phase 3 diagnostic evaluation. So this is working with the Gilberg Center in Sweden and colleagues psychiatric and pediatric and medical here in Scotland. And we've now recruited 760 children between Sweden and the United Kingdom in order to determine whether or not the results of that first study were accurate. And the results are coming out and they are looking quite positive. So the idea is that we can use the iPad to detect the movements that children are making in an ecological, friendly and fun way. So those movements that are organized by that 5 to 13 hertz inferior olive can be recorded in a fun way, playing games on the iPad. This is the idea. We can then use those movement data, because the iPad's packed with touchscreen sensors and inertial sensors inside. We can use that movement data with machine learning and artificial intelligence data analytics to determine the patterns that identify autism and the patterns that identify neurotypical kids. So this is the work that we've spent a lot of time in the last few years to do, is to really improve that. We use the game flow, we use the accelerometer and gyroscope that's inside the iPad, and we use the touch screen that detects the touch and the movements of the fingers across the screen. The original study, which I'll report just right now because our big phase 3 trial is not published yet, but ought to be published, I hope, by the end of the year. So we've got those data analyzed. Is due out, and I'm not allowed to say what that is just yet. But from the previous study of 37 children with autism and 45 typically developing kids who played the two games. They played this game called sharing and a game called creativity. Just quickly, I'll show you the sharing game. The kids can touch the piece of chocolate and drag it across the screen. They can also play with other distracting things. They can move things around. Once all of the kids have a piece of chocolate, come on. And all the kids are happy, they eat their chocolate, and then the whole thing resets. And then they get fruit next, because chocolate's not very healthy, is it? But the kids like it. Okay, so that's the first game. The second game, I know we're running out of time, so I won't show the animation, but they simply collect, they simply click on one of these items, then they can trace it, and then they color. So they can do freestyle coloring, and they can color that. And again, we pick up all this movement information to understand which children may have autism and which children are typically developing. See here, a kid playing the game in the trial.
Boy, what are we going to have next?
So the beautiful thing about this is the kids don't need any instruction. In fact, although that lady was supervising her quite enthusiastically, the kids don't need instruction about how to engage. They just engage with the iPad of their own interest and of their own volition. And this means that the game is very ecological, because we're not forcing or asking the kids to do anything. And of course, in autism, children are socially averse. They don't want to do what adults tell them to do necessarily. So we need to encourage or elicit their interest in another way, and iPads is a great way to do it. This is a heat map of two games, two different gameplay sessions, one from a neurotypical kid and one from a kid with autism. And I think you can probably tell which is which. So the neurotypical kid's following the standard kind of story or narrative, and making nice swiping movements, but the kid with autism in this case is quite chaotic. The interest is different, and then beneath that interest, the way that those movements are carried out is also different. So statistically, this gives us up to about 93% accuracy. So anywhere from the mid 80s to the early 90s in terms of accuracy. We used a number of different machine learning algorithms to analyze these, so we developed a number of models. And one model, of course, was the best one, and that's the one that we chose to focus on, this one down at the bottom, the greedy forest. If you look at the receiver operating characteristics, the sensitivity and specificity are quite high. They are comparable to a component of the ADOS, so the standard kind of research and clinical tool used to diagnose or used to assess autism for a diagnosis, has similar comparable sensitivity and specificity, and that's at about 0.8 for the creativity game, 0.88 specificity, and about 0.8 for the sharing food game, and a little bit reduced specificity for the food game. But so that's similar to the kinds of tools that require high skill, high training, lots of practitioner contact, appointments to come into a special lab, or carrying special equipment to the child's house. We can get a similar accuracy with the iPad. But of course, the iPad should never be used alone, just as no instrument should ever be used alone. It's not to replace diagnosis, simply to aid, to assist in the assessment and diagnosis. And it also teaches us a little bit about what those movements are telling us, how those movements are different. And this is actually work that we've been doing on the back of the trial, and that we have a few papers coming out with more precision now. But we understand the movements are not coordinated ahead in time. They're not coordinated with knowledge of the forces that are being generated in the movement, and therefore they often crash into they'll smash into the screen. So the iPad is hit quite hard in the children with autism, whereas the children who are neurotypical will touch the screen gently. Will just touch the screen gently. And of course, these kinds of movements that have different prospective organization are the same movements that the child will use, the same neuromotor system the child will use to express his or her intentions or interest with a partner, with a social other. And of course, we're neurotypical people, adults, will perceive those movements and those intentions differently, and therefore it's possible that there can be a communication disjunction. The intersubjectivity can become less intersubjective, so less shared understanding. And this may be one of the key factors that underpins the development of what later becomes autistic symptomatology, or the autistic symptoms of social isolation, withdrawal, distress, and things of this nature, thwarted learning and development. The team now that we're working with to close that trial, we're funded by the Horizon 2020. Harry Mata is a company that commercialized and came up with the game idea. We're working with all of these people together to conclude the trial between Sweden and Glasgow. Chris Gilbert, Helen Minnis, Phil Wilson, and Alex McConaughey on the bioinformatics and biostatistics side. We're also working on innovating as a lab. We're working on innovating new wearables so that we can just strap on wearables, small, like an Apple Watch or a Fitbit, and strap that on younger children who don't even engage with iPads to be able to use the same algorithms to detect those movement differences in younger children. And we're also trying to use, we're also using the games to be able to better identify these motor differences in autism. This is one of my favorite papers from Jennifer Cook, who did a very simple experiment, and I think illustrates the movement difference in autism most clearly. It was an experiment where the adults with autism, so 40-year-old adults with autism, were asked to swing their arms like this. Yeah, very simple. And she compared those movements with non-autistic, with neurotypical adults. And you can see here the differences. ASD is in red. So you have these velocity, the velocity is much higher in autism than it is in the neurotypical individuals. The acceleration is more variable and higher in the autistic individuals than it is in the neurotypical individuals. But interestingly, jerk is much more pronounced. The amplitudes of the jerk are much more highly pronounced in the autistic individuals than they are in the neurotypical individuals. And that is interesting because that jerk is what efficiently conveys affect feeling in the style and form of movement, what Dan Stern called the vitality affects that communicate the feeling in the movement. That's all controlled subtly in the jerk. It's what the dancers use to time the expressivity of their movements, and it's what musicians, of course, need to control and organize to get the expressivity in the timing of their movements when they play their instruments. So I think that's plenty of food for thought. My apologies for the sometimes technical language, and I hope our translators had a good time with this. And thank you for your attention. Thank you also to my collaborators in multiple locations, but especially to my lab members who have taken part in this work, especially Tzu Ching. My new colleague Penelope Dunbar, who is an individual with autism, but also a scholar and a scientist, and our colleagues in engineering and rehabilitation science. So thank you very much, and please feel free to ask any questions, and if your question doesn't get in today, I would welcome your email. Feel free to drop me a line. So thank you very much.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias, Jonathan, por la presentación. Tenemos unos minutos para hacer preguntas y respuestas. Les vamos a pedir a ustedes que hagan por la herramienta de preguntas y respuestas del Zoom. Y Valentina ya puede, ahí tenemos algunas ya escritas, podrías traducirle a Jonathan y le damos un tiempito para contestarlas.
Not directly. So primary intersubjectivity is the feeling and engagement between two or more individuals that are directly engaged face to face, and the actions of one individual then becomes perceived and felt by the other individual in the same time, and the other individual responds to that, so that the subjectivity of one person becomes a key part of the subjectivity of the other person, and that's without reference to anything else. So it's just direct intersubjectivity, which is primary intersubjectivity, which is what babies do when they are born. They engage with the other person's subjectivity, and the mother, the father, the grandparents, the nurse, the other people, they engage with the baby's subjectivity, and you share purely subjective experience. That's primary intersubjectivity, what Colwyn called primary intersubjectivity, and Hubley, right? So from their very famous paper, Penelope Hubley, I think it is. The secondary intersubjectivity is the introduction of an object into that primary intersubjective relationship, so that now you have two individuals and they're focused on a coffee, or playing the piano, or reading a book, or tickling. So, which is interesting because tickling is like a proto. This is an idea from Koichi Negayama in Tokyo, in Waseda University, that tickling is like a secondary intersubjectivity, because you're focusing on a part of the body and a particular sensation like an object. But it's still bodily, it's still part of your subjectivity and yourself. So it's primary, but becoming secondary, right? And so, but then formally, when you're engaged with an object, something in the outside world, another thing, that's secondary intersubjectivity. So it's a little bit different from primary consciousness, because primary consciousness is direct experience in the moment. And secondary consciousness is being able to categorize and understand those experiences emotionally and remember them. So it's not yet with this. It's going on along a different kind of explanation of consciousness than what secondary intersubjectivity is going along, because I suppose you can have secondary intersubjectivity with that simply with primary consciousness. Actually, I would need to think about that a little bit more, but you don't need tertiary consciousness certainly to engage in primary or in secondary intersubjectivity. So the two things are explaining slightly different things. One is explaining individual conscious experience, and the other one is explaining that intersubjective dynamic and organization. I hope that helped. Can you repeat the question, the beginning of the question? I guess I'm not clear on what cognitive modification is, or cognitive plasticity. So I'm not familiar with the term. Maybe it's just a translation, or can you explain the term a bit better? Okay, yeah, it's just understanding what the intervention was, or what the process was, is the cognitive modification. So yeah. Yes, whether you see that whether you can use that as a diagnostic for an individual, we don't know yet. But the study from Filippo Muratori and Paolo Bosco and other studies demonstrate that the brain stems of children with autism are on average as a group different in size and shape. That difference can change also over development. So at the age of 5, we found that they were larger. But if I'm not mistaken, Zhu and colleagues in the United States found that in older children, they become smaller. So it looks like there's a growth trajectory difference. But that's a group difference. It's not an individual difference. So whether or not an individual could be identified based on those differences is still unknown. So what's really interesting is that the brainstem is a deep brain system. It's very compact, and the tissue is very different from the cortex. It's harder to image than the neocortex, which is one reason I think why the neocortex is so popular in cognitive neuroscience, is because it's accessible to the imaging technology. The brainstem is protected by more bone. It's also a denser tissue. It's also smaller. So your pixel resolution, if you think about your pixel resolution on your screen or on your phone, it's not as clear. So you can't get as much information as you would like to really identify differences in autism. But technology is changing and keeps growing, right? So now they have 7 Tesla MRI, which is becoming almost standard, becoming the new standard. And with 7 Tesla, we think you can get a high enough resolution to be able to detect those very subtle differences very similar to the post-mortem histology, the brain tissue. And of course, now we have 10.9 Tesla, right? So 10 or 11 Tesla MRI. And that will be even finer grain resolution. So the resolution, just like the resolution on our mobile phones and our cameras keeps improving, the resolution of the MRI technology keeps improving. And we need that improved resolution to be able to image the brainstem properly. So I think that's a really interesting question, and I think we'll get to know the answer a few years down the line, and we're working towards that. So we have a project set up to begin to do that work, to pilot that possibility. So thank you for the question.
Bien, Daniel, seleccionamos alguna pregunta, vamos en orden, las hacemos todas. Me preguntaba eso Valentina.
Valentina, vamos a hacer lo siguiente. Te voy a pedir que las leas las preguntas que están por ahora. Vamos a cerrar las preguntas. Y Jonathan puede elegir la que él considere que le gustaría para finalizar por hoy.
Yeah. Okay, I think I can do all of them if you have time. I can be quick. I can try. So the first one is, what age do the kids start playing the iPad games? So kids start playing iPads at about 2 to 3 years old, right? Is the kind of earliest age. And our game is designed for kids that are 2.5 years old. And then we look at kids playing the game up until 6 years old. Although we're doing a study with the University of Southern California with Lisa Azizadeh, and for that we use the iPad game with 11-year-old kids and even 18-year-old kids, and my kids still play the game because they like it. I mean, the game's a fun game, right? So yeah, adults can play it. It's a fun game. But in terms of diagnosis or assessment, the age range is 2.5 years to the end of the 5th year. That's the window that we're really focusing on. So if we want to go younger than 2.5 years, we need something different, which is why we want to develop wearable devices next, right? Okay, so the second question was, could we contribute to the development of the brainstem and get closer to expected brainstem development? Well, I should say that in terms of clinically, I think the understanding about the brainstem is still very early, still very immature for translation to clinical practice. The growth of the brainstem it's not really very well studied. So we don't know an awful lot about these brainstem differences, and we need to know more about these brainstem differences. The problem is that that neuroscience and cognitive neuroscience or neuropsychology is really focused on the cortex. You go to a neuroscience conference or a neuropsychology conference, and people show you pictures of the brain and their brain analysis, and they call it the brain. The brainstem is cut off. It's not even there. But it's so important. Evolution from the point of evolution and personal development and function of conscious experience and learning is fundamentally important. So it's a really big omission in the academic field in science. It's a big omission that we're trying to help to remedy. The last question was about, I'll just skip to it, which was about how many researchers are there that show brainstem differences. It's only a handful. I can only think of 4 papers off the top of my head, that 4 or 5, maybe 6 papers that show brainstem differences. It's not a lot. It's not very many groups, and this is why we need to have more data. And I'm just thinking in terms of neuroanatomy, just the anatomy of the brainstem. So we need better. Actually, that's probably if you include the histology. This is the neuroimaging data. If you include the histology, it's probably considerably more. But we also have neurophysiology evidence. For example, the Startler response, the acoustic brainstem response as well. There's lots of neurophysiological evidence that also points to the brainstem. So the best source at the moment of this is Brittany Travers' paper. She has a Frontiers paper. If you Google Travers, Travers, brainstem, autism, and it's in Frontiers, which is an open access journal. She's reviewed all of the current evidence for brainstem differences in autism, and it's a really quite thorough review. So I would go there to really get your up-to-date understanding. But it's growing, and her paper is a few years old now. So the question about the unconscious, pre-conscious situation in autism. So that slide was showing how Jaak Panksepp now understands primary consciousness, and how we understand primary consciousness is what Freud more than 100 years ago would have called, about 100 years ago, would have called the unconscious, or the pre-conscious. But we now understand that so-called unconscious system is actually a conscious system in its own right. It's actually a conscious system, but it's operating at a different level than the level of reflective, tertiary cognition and language, right? And we're understanding embodiment more. We're understanding the importance of movement and expressivity. We're understanding the fact that non-verbal engagement can be just as meaningful and important as linguistically elaborated verbal engagement. And we're understanding that the basic feelings and subjectivities and basic operations of the brain are also conscious subjectivities and conscious activities of the brain. So it's not that we still think that they're pre-conscious or unconscious. We now look at it as levels of consciousness. Each level has this particular domain or area of operation, as it were. So the cortex is reflective and linguistic in a crude sense, and the brainstem is immediate and concerned with integrating senses and organizing those, evaluating the situation, and enacting action, right? So it's in the moment, movement and expression. The mirror neuron system is involved in this, absolutely. Colwyn calls the mirror neuron system, he says it should be called the sympathy neuron system. In other words, those mirroring neurons are sympathetic. They're acting in resonance with the feelings and the intentions of the other person. To dissociate the feelings and the intentions, in his view, and I agree with him, is a mistake, because feelings are entwined, they're part and parcel of those intentions. This is the point that Dan Stern made about forms of vitality affects. These are feelings that we wouldn't say, they're not classical emotions like happiness or sadness, but they're feelings of vitality, which express something of the subjectivity, the conscious subjectivity of the individual. So it could be that mirror neurons are actually sympathy neurons, but I'm actually not up to speed with the debate in terms of the mirror neuron system. But certainly, from a philosophical point of view, it's perhaps a misnomer to dissociate feelings from the movement. And last but not least, it was this practical question about a 4-year-old child who's having difficulty in a classroom and is banging and kicking and scratching the walls and things. It's very hard, of course, to judge what's happening, and you need to use your better professional judgment because you are in with the child. But I would just perhaps consider that the child might be suffering in the classroom. And that might need to get out outside of the classroom, and that could be because of sensory issues. It could be as simple as being overwhelmed by sensations, and it may be hard to understand to what those sensations are. But it could be the fabric of the desk. It could be the noise of the air conditioning. It could be something that could be really bothering that child sensorially in the classroom, or it could be the social pressure and the requirements in that classroom. So it sounds like that the best thing might be to find to work on the environment. the physical and sensory environment, and then the social environment. But you need to get the basics right first, sensory environment first, and then social environment, and then the task, the shared project. So it might be difficult, I know, because there's requirements in law about teaching, but it might be necessary to think a little bit more widely about how to deal with that. So you have to use your judgment, but I hope that my thoughts have helped in some way. And I think that's it for the questions. Are there more questions I can answer, or how would you like to proceed, Sophia?
No, that's great, Jonathan. Let us finish now. Agradecemos enormemente a la presencia de todos ustedes, a las muy buenas preguntas que han también brindado. Y bueno, y agradezco nuevamente a la presencia de Jonathan, que nos ha hecho una excelente presentación y mostrando, bueno, caminos que podríamos seguir ahí en nuestra práctica, nuestra investigación, nuestra clínica. Así que, bueno, queda mi gratitud por la transmisión de los conocimientos que nos hizo hoy. Así que le paso la palabra a Sofía, que hace el cierre de nuestro encuentro hoy.
Bueno, también sumarme al agradecimiento de Daniel, agradecerle nuevamente a Jonathan, a Valentina. Y bueno, para ir cerrando, contarles que nos encontraremos de vuelta el 8 de octubre con la conferencia ¿Qué precede a la expresión fenotípica del autismo tal como la conocemos? Centrarse en el desarrollo del movimiento con Fabio Pichela. Va a ser a las 9 de la mañana. Recordarles que pueden encontrar la información de la próxima conferencia y del resto en la página del CICP, así como también en la página de Facultad de Psicología. Agradecerles nuevamente por su asistencia, por la asistencia de las anteriores conferencias y al ciclo. Y bueno, creo que un poco por ahí. Nuevamente gracias a Jonathan y a todos y a todas por estar hoy.
Thank you, Sophia and Daniel, for having me, and Valentina for translating. So thank you very much, and for everyone for coming. So thank you.